What if the largest inequalities in the world were not primarily caused by resources, institutions, or history, but by differences in inherited cognitive ability between human populations? Few ideas in modern social science are more controversial than this one. Yet it continues to appear in academic debates, policy discussions, and public arguments about global inequality. Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Yeah, that is a incredibly heavy premise to start us off.
It really is. And for this deep dive, we're going to use a specific book as our analytical entry point to explore this. We are looking at the global bell curve, Race, IQ, and Inequality Worldwide by Richard Lynn.
Right. And this book, it essentially attempts to link race, intelligence testing, and global socioeconomic hierarchy into this one massive explanatory narrative.
Exactly. Now, before we really get into the weeds of how this framework operates, I want to set some firm ground rules for you, the listener, because, this is highly politically charged material.
Oh, absolutely.
So our goal here is to do a strictly impartial, systems-level analysis. We are not here to endorse the viewpoints in this text. We are not taking sides.
Right. We're treating the book as an object of study.
Yeah. We just want to unpack how this specific explanatory framework operates. Why does it persist in discourse? And crucially, what structural layers of reality might it obscure when you view the world entirely through this lens?
And viewed through a systems lens, what Lynn does in this book is actually construct a framework connecting several different institutional domains.
Okay, break that down for me. What are the domains?
Well, first is the biological system. This is where intelligence is treated as a largely inherited trait, influenced heavily by genetic variation.
Okay, so biology is the foundation.
Yes. And second is the economic system. This is where labor markets reward that cognitive ability through earnings, occupational status, productivity, things like that.
Right, the market pays you for being smart.
Exactly. Then third, you have the institutional system. So education systems, professional credentialing these, translate that measured biological ability into actual socioeconomic stratification.
Got it.
And finally, the fourth domain is the policy system. Within Lynn's framework, things like welfare programs or affirmative action, they are framed as these sort of artificial attempts by governments to override what he interprets as natural cognitive hierarchies.
So basically, within this framework, global inequality just becomes the mathematically expected outcome of how cognitive ability is distributed across populations.
That is exactly his thesis.
So to understand how he builds this machinery, we should introduce the architect. Richard Lynn was a psychologist. He was very well known for his cross-national intelligence research.
Yeah, and this book is essentially an ambitious global extension of a very famous, very controversial 1994 American book
Oh, right, the bell curve.
by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. What they did was look at the United States, and they argued that the socioeconomic hierarchy there was driven largely by intelligence.
Right, they looked at data showing whites generally at the top, Hispanics in the middle, and blacks at the bottom, and claimed it was due to innate cognitive differences.
Exactly. And Lynn takes that specific American premise and basically decides to zoom out to the entire planet.
He's saying it's not just an American phenomenon.
Right. He argues that this racial and ethnic difference in average intelligence is a universal global phenomenon. It's the primary driver of wealth and social status everywhere.
It's honestly as if sociologists and historians have spent the last century looking at this massive, complex global lock with thousands of tumblers. History, geography, colonial resources, institutions. And Lynn's walking up to it claiming he's found the single biological master key that just opens everything.
Master key is a really great way to visualize it. But, to convince people to use your new master key, you first have to prove that all the other keys they've been using are totally defective.
Oh, right. He has to clear the field.
Exactly. And he spends the early part of the book systematically dismissing alternative social science theories to make room for his biological one.
So let's actually walk through how he does that, because his methodology here is really interesting. He starts by going after cultural values theory, right?
Yeah. So cultural values theory is the idea that different groups succeed or fail based on their cultural attitudes toward work, education, family structure. The classic example is Max Weber's Protestant work ethic.
Right. The idea that Northern European Protestants had a cultural imperative to work hard and save, which built capitalism.
Exactly. And modern theorists like David Landes apply that globally. But Lynn critiques this by pointing out a massive hindsight bias in cultural theory.
And the example he uses for this is fascinating. He points to how Western observers used to talk about Confucianism in China.
Yes, it's a very sharp critique. Lynn points out that back in the early to mid 20th century, when China and East Asia were economically struggling, Western cultural theorists blamed Confucianism.
Right, they said it was too traditional.
Yeah, they claimed its emphasis on filial piety and strict hierarchy was this backward-looking philosophy that actively prevented modernization.
But then you jump forward a few decades and suddenly you have these massive economic miracles in Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan.
Right, they become absolute economic powerhouses, and what do the cultural theorists do?
They completely flip the script.
Exactly. Suddenly, they start attributing East Asia's booming success to those exact same Confucian values.
Like, oh, filial piety actually means a strong family unit that supports intense studying.
Yeah, and respect for hierarchy suddenly means a highly disciplined corporate workforce. Lynn argues that if you can use a theory to explain both absolute economic failure and an economic miracle just by changing your subjective interpretation after the fact,
Then the theory has zero predictive power.
right, it's unfalsifiable.
Okay, so that's how he knocks out culture. What about structuralism? This is a huge one.
Yeah, structuralism is the idea that hierarchies are maintained by institutional discrimination, systemic racism, barriers to entry, powerful groups hoarding resources.
He specifically targets theorists like John Ogbu here, who argued that caste ideologies and systemic barriers suppress minority performance.
And Lynn's counter to this relies heavily on matched data. He points out that even when you match minority and majority groups for educational qualifications,
So comparing two people who both have, say, a bachelor's degree.
right, even when they have the exact same schooling on paper, disparities in socioeconomic status and earnings sometimes still remain.
Now, if I'm a structuralist, I look at that and say, well, obviously, that proves there's invisible discrimination in hiring. Two people have the same degree, but the minority candidate gets paid less.
But Lynn flips that assumption. He argues that a degree doesn't perfectly capture raw cognitive ability. He claims the majority group might still possess higher average innate intelligence even within that pool of degree holders.
So he just shifts the blame entirely away from the institution's potential bias back onto the individual's inherent biology.
Exactly. He basically demands that structuralists prove absolute cognitive equivalence before he will accept institutional bias as a factor.
Wow. Okay, then he goes after human capital theory. And this is like the darling theory of modern economists.
Oh, absolutely. The idea that formal education and skills drive economic wealth. Economists say, invest in education and your GDP will go up.
But Lynn says that doesn't dig deep enough into the causality.
Right. He doesn't deny that education correlates with wealth, but he argues that economists fail to explain why certain groups acquire more education in the first place.
Okay, let me see if I can wrap my head around this with an analogy. If you dismiss human capital theory because it doesn't explain why people get educated, isn't that like dismissing the importance of a car's engine because it doesn't explain who bought the car?
That is a brilliant analogy, yes. Economists are looking at the education. They're measuring the horsepower.
And Lynn is asking who has the innate capacity to buy and operate the car.
Exactly. For Lynn, intelligence is the bedrock. Human capital is just a downstream symptom of that biological bedrock.
Okay, so he's taken a wrecking ball to culture, structuralism, and human capital. He's cleared the field for his biological master key. But how does he actually map this onto the real world?
This is where we get into the design, incentives, and outcomes of his framework. Lynn argues that modern economic and institutional systems are inherently designed to be meritocratic.
Meaning they rely on measurable signals.
Yeah.
Standardized tests, degrees, performance metrics.
Right. Labor markets reward cognitive ability. And education systems act as this massive sorting mechanism. They translate measured ability into socioeconomic stratification.
And because he claims intelligence is largely inherited and unequally distributed, this institutional sorting machine inevitably creates a global hierarchy.
Yes. And as these measurements accumulate, they appear to confirm the hierarchy they helped produce. Education predicts earnings, earnings predict wealth.
It's a self-reinforcing loop. And to prove this sorting mechanism works everywhere, he basically takes the reader on a world tour.
Right. He uses global case studies to argue that this happens regardless of the local political system or history. Let's look at his data on Britain.
Okay, Britain, capitalist economy, diverse immigrant population. The book cites 1994 earnings data for men in Britain.
And what does it show?
It shows Chinese immigrants earning the most at 368 pounds a week, then native whites at 331 pounds, and blacks at 311. But he gets really nuanced here. He doesn't treat the black population as a monolith.
Right. He separates African-born blacks from native-born Afro-Caribbeans.
And he points out that African-born immigrants actually achieve much higher socioeconomic status than the native-born Afro-Caribbeans.
Which is a fascinating data point.
Yeah, a structuralist would say, hey, that proves it's not just about skin color. It's about immigrant drive or class background before migrating. How does Lynn counter that?
He interprets it through what he calls cognitive selection. He argues that migration isn't random. The Africans who navigate the complex immigration system to reach Britain, often as doctors or students, they are a highly selected, high IQ subset of their home population.
So the sorting machine started before they even got on the plane.
Precisely. By contrast, he notes that the Afro-Caribbean population largely arrived post-World War II to fill manual labor shortages. So he claims you're looking at two populations with differing baseline intelligence due to historical selection.
It always comes back to the cognitive baseline for him. Okay, let's jump from Britain to Brazil. This is a huge case study because Brazil was long held up as this racial democracy.
Yeah, for a long time, the global community looked at Brazil and thought, wow, they figured it out because they didn't have strict, legally enforced segregation like Jim Crow in the U.S. or apartheid in South Africa.
People just assumed it was this egalitarian paradise.
But Lynn pulls census data to show that this is a complete myth. Even without legal segregation, Brazil developed massive residential segregation.
The favelas.
Right. He points to places like the Giramento favela in Rio, massive poverty, lack of infrastructure. And when he cross-references who lives in the affluent coastal areas versus the favelas, a rigid hierarchy emerges.
The text notes it's whites and ethnic Japanese at the top, then mulattoes in the middle, and black Brazilians at the bottom. And this is consistent across earnings, literacy, infant mortality.
And the crux of Lynn's argument here is that because the state didn't legally force this hierarchy to exist, its organic emergence proves it's a natural sorting based on innate cognitive ability.
If the law didn't do it, biology must have.
That's his thesis. And he applies that exact same logic to communist Cuba.
Oh, this one is wild.
Yeah.
Because Cuba is the ultimate stress test for his theory. In 1959, Castro's revolution takes over, and a core pillar of that Marxist state was the strict eradication of racial prejudice and class hierarchy.
They nationalized everything. Standardized wages, massive literacy campaigns. If inequality is purely the result of capitalist resource hoarding, then a centralized communist state should flatten the racial hierarchy completely.
But the book points out that even decades after the revolution, whites still dominated professional and administrative occupations. He cites 1981 data showing whites at 35% in these roles, compared to mulattoes at 29% and blacks at 31%.
Right. And Lynn's analytical takeaway is that if a capitalist system like Britain, a supposedly multicultural system like Brazil, and a strict communist system like Cuba all produce roughly the same hierarchy.
The driving force has to transcend politics.
Exactly. For him, it must be genetic intelligence.
And to really cement that it's about a specific cognitive metric and not just, global white supremacy, he brings up Hawaii.
Hawaii is a profound anomaly for traditional structural theories.
Yeah, because the hierarchy is completely flipped.
In the mainland U.S. or Europe, Caucasians are typically at the top. But Lynn presents data showing that in Hawaii, East Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Korean populations sit at the socioeconomic top, alongside or even above Caucasians.
And populations like the Portuguese, who are historically considered white in the West, sit near the bottom, alongside Puerto Ricans and Native Hawaiians.
Right. And to explain this inverted hierarchy, Lynn looks at the history of migration. The Portuguese largely emigrated to work as manual laborers on sugar plantations. He claims psychometric data suggests this specific population has historically lower average IQs than Northern Europeans.
Meanwhile, he points out testing shows East Asian populations scoring higher in specific cognitive domains, particularly spatial IQ.
Right.
Wait, let's clarify that. What actually is spatial IQ?
Spatial intelligence is the capacity to mentally manipulate 2D and 3D figures. It's the ability to reason and remember spatial relations among objects.
Like engineering or architecture skills?
Exactly. And Lynn argues East Asian populations test higher on this metric.
Okay, so in Hawaii, you have all these groups, Portuguese, Japanese, Chinese, Native Hawaiians, starting at the exact same structural baseline. They were all poor manual laborers on plantations.
They started at the same starting line. But over a century, they stratified, and Lynn argues they stratified exactly according to their measured cognitive abilities. The groups with higher measured intelligence moved off the plantations, started businesses, got educated.
So Hawaii is his ultimate proof of concept. He's saying, look, it's not about institutional white supremacy. It's about the cognitive master key.
That is the rhetorical architecture of his argument, yeah?
It's a very neat story. But as you get deeper into the book, you hit the extremes of his data, the places where he finds the absolute widest gaps.
Yeah.
And this is where we really need to apply some systems analysis.
Yes. The chapters on Australia and Africa are arguably the most controversial in the text because the biological conclusions he draws are just completely uncompromising.
Let's start with Australia. He contrasts the high performance of Chinese immigrant children with native Australian Aborigines, and he cites modern psychometric testing that places Aboriginal IQs between 58 and 74.
Which is an incredibly low band.
Yeah, 58 to 74. If you score a 58 in a Western country, you are considered to have a severe intellectual disability. How is he measuring this?
Well, he synthesizes studies that relied heavily on specific cognitive tools, like the Porteous maze.
Okay, wait, what actually is a Porteous maze?
It's essentially a series of printed paper mazes. The subject gets a pencil and has to trace a path through the maze without crossing the printed lines or hitting dead ends. It measures nonverbal forethought.
You're kidding. So imagine you are an Aboriginal Australian in the mid-20th century. Your culture relies on deeply complex oral traditions, communal knowledge, spatial navigation of the desert using song lines. And a Western researcher sits you at a desk, hands you a piece of paper, a medium you might rarely use, and a pencil, and times you on tracing a box.
That is the massive, glaring system critique of this data. You're taking a tool designed in an industrialized, paper-based educational system, dropping it into a completely alien cultural context, and treating the resulting friction purely as a deficit of innate brain power.
You're measuring their unfamiliarity with the test, not the capacity of their brain.
Exactly. But Lynn rejects that cultural load argument entirely. He treats the scores as objective biological facts, and he correlates them with devastating social metrics, high unemployment, high infant mortality.
He even cites some highly controversial physical data, right? A study claiming Aborigines have smaller brain sizes.
Yes, he relies on a 1990 study by Smith and Beals claiming an 85 cubic centimeter difference in brain size, which he links directly to cognitive capacity. But the leap from brain volume to complex intelligence is highly contested in modern neuroscience.
Because it ignores neural density, cortical folding, everything else.
Right.
And he does something very similar in Africa. He compares native black populations in East and South Africa with the Indian populations that migrated there as laborers or merchants.
Right. He cites data from Uganda showing Indian residents with an average IQ of 82 compared to 69 for the native black population. And he correlates this testing gap with a massive wealth gap.
So again, biology is destiny. The sorting machine works in Africa just like it works in Hawaii.
But this is where the measurement trap becomes undeniable. Because if we look at the systems involved, the feedback loops, the book's own data tables undermine its biological conclusion.
Exactly. Because right next to those IQ tables showing a score of 69 in Uganda, the book provides tables showing severe disparities in malnutrition, extreme poverty, infectious disease, infant mortality.
And from a systems perspective, you cannot separate the measurement from the environment. When a child experiences severe protein malnutrition in their first 3 years, it literally impedes the myelination of neurons in the brain.
The physical insulation for cognitive signals.
Yes. And chronic poverty creates elevated cortisol levels, which physically impairs the development of the prefrontal cortex. That is a biological reality. But the source text sees the lower test score and blames inherited genetics, completely ignoring the environmental deprivation that altered the brain's hardware.
Okay, let me use an analogy here because this is so crucial. Imagine you have 2 seeds from the exact same plant, genetically identical. You plant one in a lush greenhouse with perfect lighting and fertilizer.
Okay.
You plant the other in the middle of a barren desert. A year later, you measure them. The greenhouse plant is 3 feet tall. The desert plant is 3 inches tall. If you use your tape measure to scientifically prove the desert plant has inferior genetics, you are completely ignoring the soil and the water.
That is a perfect illustration. The IQ test is the tape measure. It's accurately measuring a disparity at that moment in time. But Lynn leaps from that accurate measurement to an assumption of genetic causality.
He's blind to the system. And what's wild is that there's a massive contradiction in his own text that proves the environment matters.
Oh, the data on Indian immigrants in Britain.
Yes. When we were talking about Britain, Lynn admits that when Indian children arrive in the UK, within just a few years, they see a massive 14-point jump in their average IQ scores compared to their peers back home.
And he explicitly attributes that gain to better nutrition, English fluency, and better education in the UK.
There's a 14-point jump. That's almost a full standard deviation. He acknowledges the greenhouse effect. He admits that changing the soil and water physically changes the cognitive output.
Right.
But despite his own data showing this, he still maintains that the baseline differences between races are permanent and genetic.
It shows how environmental feedback loops are acknowledged in the text, but ultimately subordinated to the biological narrative. The master key has to be preserved at all costs.
So if you believe these hierarchies are natural and genetic, how do you view government policy? How do you view affirmative action?
Well, within Lynn's framework, the policy system is viewed as a highly destructive intervention. Welfare and affirmative action are framed as artificial attempts to override the natural cognitive hierarchy.
The book points to Brazil to prove this doesn't work. In 2002, state universities in Rio introduced strict 40% quotas for Black and mulatto students to address inequality.
And the institutional reaction to that policy was fascinating. Lynn notes that because the universities couldn't find enough minority students who could pass the rigorous entrance exams to fill that massive quota, the policy backfired.
Universities actually started making the entrance exams harder overall to covertly subvert the quotas and stop white students from falsely claiming minority status.
It's an example of the institutional system fighting the policy system.
But here's where it gets really, really interesting. This is my favorite data point in the entire source material. It's the paradox of matched data.
This completely flips the script on how we understand systemic bias.
Right. We talked about matching for education earlier. This is about matching for IQ itself. The book looks at what happens when you take a group of Black Americans and white Americans who have the exact same measured IQ.
Specifically, an IQ of 114, which is about one standard deviation above average, a very smart cohort.
The text shows that at an IQ of 114, 68% of the Black individuals graduated from college, compared to only 50% of the white individuals. And it goes further. Matched for that exact same IQ of a 114, Black professionals are vastly overrepresented in high-status professions like medicine and law. The data shows the expected ratio of Black to white physicians at an IQ of 112 should be 1 to 20. But the actual observed ratio is 1 to 3.
Let that sink in. When cognitive capital is perfectly equal, the racial hierarchy we've been tracking doesn't just shrink, it vanishes, it reverses.
Black individuals vastly outperform white individuals at the exact same intelligence level. So how does Lynn interpret this without breaking his framework?
Well, he uses this to attack affirmative action. He claims this proves that systemic discrimination against minorities doesn't exist, and that this advantage is due entirely to positive discrimination corporations artificially pushing minorities up for diversity metrics.
He thinks it proves the system is biased in favor of minorities.
Right.
But if we look at this as systems thinkers, what he's actually proving is that institutions are not passive receivers of biology. When cognitive capital is equal, institutions highly reward marginalized groups.
Exactly. It completely undermines biological determinism. If institutions, through diversity policies or scholarships, can take the exact same raw cognitive material and produce vastly different outcomes, it proves definitively that the system can alter the outcomes.
Biology is not absolute destiny. The institution dictates how biology is rewarded.
Right.
But Lynn takes his determinism to an even darker conclusion. He briefly touches on this idea of dysgenic fertility.
Yeah, dysgenic fertility is a concept that appears frequently in this specific subset of literature. It's the demographic observation that higher-educated, wealthier populations tend to have fewer children,
while populations with less formal education, lower incomes, and what Lynn would classify as lower IQs tend to have higher fertility rates.
No, most sociologists view this as a natural demographic transition driven by urbanization and women entering the workforce. But Lynn views it as a biological crisis. He believes the genotypic intelligence of the global population is declining because the less intelligent are out-reproducing the highly intelligent.
It's a deeply deterministic, bleak worldview. If you believe intelligence is the sole driver of civilization and is purely genetic, different birth rates become an existential threat.
Absolutely.
So, bringing this all together, We've mapped out the master key theory. We see the global case studies, the extreme measurements, the measurement trap. What is the core crisis in perception that this book reveals?
The crisis here goes way beyond debates over psychometric testing methodologies. It is fundamentally about how we perceive inequality itself. The danger of this framework is how easily complex, brutal systems of historical inequality can be sanitized and reinterpreted as natural hierarchies, simply by replacing structural analysis with mathematical measurement.
Right. When a society treats a test score or a salary purely as a reflection of inherent biology, the context is completely deleted.
The historical conditions of colonialism disappear. The legacy of redlining, the extreme nutritional deficits, the cultural design of the tests themselves, all these massive systemic factors are rendered invisible. They are collapsed into a single biological number.
Think about this in your own life. Have you ever looked at a metric, maybe a KPI at work, or a standardized test score at school, and assumed it was a pure, objective measure of your inherent talent? Did you ignore the systemic advantages that help produce that number? The private tutoring, the stable home environment?
Or conversely, have you ever felt fundamentally inferior because of a metric, ignoring the systemic disadvantages you face?
What stands out to you when you hear these statistics and how they are weaponized to define human potential?
Systems analysis teaches us that social hierarchies almost never result from a single variable. They emerge from an incredibly messy interaction between biology, institutions, history, and environment. A master K is tempting because it's simple. It absolves us of the responsibility to fix the environment. But reality is a complex system.
And complex systems resist simple keys. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've spent this entire deep dive looking at a framework that assumes spatial puzzles and logic problems dictate the global hierarchy. But what if tomorrow the global economic system drastically changed to primarily reward a completely different set of cognitive traits, say, profound emotional empathy, creative synthesis, or communal conflict resolution, rather than spatial reasoning and strict logic? Would this global bell curve we've been talking about completely invert? And if it did, wouldn't that prove that these hierarchies are far less about the unyielding natural laws of human biology and much more about what the people who built the institutions simply decided was valuable?
It challenges the very foundation of how we measure merit.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you could become a supporter on Patreon.
And for a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Remember, the lock is complicated, and the water matters just as much as the seed.